The sands of Kaelith stretched endlessly under a sky painted in hues no human had ever seen before. They shimmered like liquid gold, shifting and writhing as though alive, their movements creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The air above them hummed faintly, charged with an energy that made the hairs on anyone's neck stand on end. This was the Death Sands, a place whispered about in legends among spacers, explorers, and scavengers alike. A place where nothing lived for long, where even machines faltered and died. It was said that those who entered never returned, not because they were killed, but because something far worse happened to them, something no one dared speak of aloud. Captain Lira Voss stood at the edge of this desolate expanse, her boots sinking slightly into the fine grains beneath her feet. She wore a weathered jacket patched together from materials scavenged across half a dozen star systems, its surface scarred by burns and tears earned during countless battles. Her dark hair was tied back into a loose braid, streaked with dust, and her sharp green eyes scanned the horizon with a mix of curiosity and defiance. To most people, the Death Sands represented death itself, a force too vast, too alien to comprehend. But to Lira, it was just another challenge waiting to be conquered. She adjusted the straps of her pack, feeling the weight of survival gear against her shoulders. Inside were tools designed to withstand extreme conditions: plasma cutters, electromagnetic dampeners, oxygen recyclers, and enough rations to last 2 weeks if she rationed carefully. Everything she needed to survive, if survival was possible here. Yet none of these preparations could quiet the gnawing unease in her gut. Not fear exactly, more like anticipation, the kind that came when you knew you were stepping into territory, where rules didn't apply, where logic broke down, and where every decision carried consequences far beyond what you could imagine. Lira wasn't reckless by nature, at least not entirely. She understood risk better than most. Growing up on Earth's overcrowded colonies, she'd learned early how to navigate chaos. When corporate overlords seized control of her family's land, leaving them destitute and scattered, she vowed never to let anyone take anything from her again. That promise drove her to become one of the galaxy's most notorious bounty hunters. Her reputation preceded her wherever she went, fearless, resourceful, and unyielding. Some called her a hero, others dismissed her as a mercenary. Either way, she didn't care. What mattered was staying ahead of the game, always moving forward, never looking back. But lately, the thrill of the hunt had started to lose its edge. The jobs grew repetitive, tracking down petty criminals, recovering stolen goods, or retrieving artifacts for wealthy collectors who cared more about profit than preservation. Each mission felt hollow, like chasing shadows instead of substance. And then there was the guilt. No matter how many victories she racked up, no matter how much money she earned, the memory of her family lingered like a ghost. Their faces haunted her dreams, their voices whispering accusations she couldn't silence. You abandoned us. You let them win. So when rumors reached her ears about a crystalline shard buried deep within the Death Sands, linked to the ancient Zorathians, she seized the opportunity without hesitation. The artifact promised power, or knowledge, or perhaps both. Whatever it was, it represented something bigger than herself, something worth risking everything for. More importantly, it gave her a chance to prove once and for all that humanity wasn't just a species clinging to the fringes of existence. Humans were survivors, innovators, fighters. If anyone could conquer the Death Sands, it would be her. The Interstellar Trade Consortium, ITC, had issued warnings about entering the region, citing unstable environmental conditions and unknown hazards. Of course they had. The ITC controlled nearly every aspect of interstellar commerce, hoarding resources and suppressing innovation to maintain their monopoly. Their warnings weren't meant to protect anyone. They were meant to keep others out, to claim what lay hidden in the sands for themselves. Lira spat onto the ground, the saliva sizzling slightly as it hit the charged sand. Screw them. If the ITC wanted the artifact, they'd have to go through her first. As she activated her hovercraft, its engines whining softly as they powered up, Lira allowed herself a moment of reflection. The craft was sleek and streamlined, modified extensively, over the years to suit her needs. Its reinforced hull gleamed dully in the strange light, pockmarked with scars from past encounters. Mounted on top was a plasma cannon capable of vaporizing most obstacles, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. For now, the weapon remained silent, its barrel pointed skyward like a sentinel. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it a low, mournful wail that sent shivers down her spine. It sounded almost human, or maybe that was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Shaking off the thought, she climbed aboard and gripped the controls tightly. Ahead of her loomed the endless sea of golden sand, undulating gently as if breathing. Somewhere out there, buried beneath layers of time and mystery, lay the answers she sought. Answers that might change everything or destroy her completely, with a final glance behind her at the barren wasteland marking the border of the Death Sands. Lira pushed the throttle forward. The hovercraft surged ahead, its thrusters kicking up plumes of glittering sand that sparkled briefly before fading into nothingness. As she crossed the threshold, the world around her shifted subtly. Gravity seemed lighter, the air thicker, charged with static electricity that crackled audibly. Above, the sky darkened ominously, swirling clouds blotting out the alien sun. The temperature dropped sharply, sending goosebumps rippling across her skin despite the insulated suit she wore. And then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the roar of the hovercraft's engines. But as she ventured deeper, they grew louder, clearer, voices speaking in languages she couldn't understand, overlapping and discordant, filling her mind with fragmented images and emotions she couldn't place. Fear, anger, despair, hope. They clawed at her consciousness, demanding attention, threatening to overwhelm her. She clenched her jaw and focused on the path ahead, refusing to let them distract her. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, she couldn't afford to listen. Not yet. Minutes turned into hours as she navigated the treacherous terrain, dodging sudden sinkholes and avoiding patches of sand that glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. Once, she caught sight of movement out of the corner of her eye, a gay, sinuous shape slithering just beneath the surface. Instinctively, she veered away, heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Sand serpents, predatory creatures native to Kaelith, rumored to be able to sense vibrations and strike with terrifying speed. She hadn't encountered any so far, but their presence was a reminder that danger lurked everywhere in this place. By the time night fell, or what passed for night in this alien environment, the landscape had transformed entirely. Towering dunes gave way to jagged cliffs of black rock, jutting out of the sands like broken teeth. Strange formations dotted the horizon, resembling ruins half buried by time. Faint lights flickered within some of them, casting long, distorted shadows that danced eerily across the ground. Lira slowed the hovercraft to a crawl, scanning the area warily. These structures were unlike anything she'd seen before. Too symmetrical, too precise to be natural. They bore the unmistakable mark of intelligent design. Her comm unit crackled unexpectedly, startling her. Static filled the channel, followed by a voice garbled and distorted beyond recognition. She frowned, adjusting the frequency manually, but the interference only worsened. Finally, she switched it off altogether, unwilling to risk drawing unwanted attention. Whoever, or whatever, was broadcasting clearly didn't want visitors. Despite the growing tension, exhaustion began to creep in. Her muscles ached from hours of concentration, and her vision blurred slightly as fatigue set in. Reluctantly, she decided to make camp near one of the larger ruins, parking the hovercraft in the shadow of its crumbling walls. After setting up a perimeter alarm and securing her supplies, she settled down to rest, wrapping herself in a thermal blanket to ward off the biting cold. Sleep eluded her, however. Every sound, the creak of metal cooling, the distant rumble of thunder, the constant hiss of the wind, kept her alert, her senses straining for any sign of danger. Eventually, she gave up trying and sat upright, staring out into the darkness. The ruins loomed overhead, their silhouettes jagged and menacing against the starless sky. Something about them unsettled her deeply, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way they seemed to watch her, silent sentinels guarding secrets older than humanity itself. Then she saw it, a faint glow emanating from within one of the structures, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Curiosity overriding caution, she grabbed a flashlight and approached cautiously, her hand resting instinctively on the hilt of her sidearm. The entrance yawned open before her, revealing a narrow corridor lined with glowing glyphs that cast an otherworldly light. Each step echoed loudly, reverberating off the walls as though amplifying her presence. The air inside was cool and stale, tinged with the metallic tang of decay. At the end of the corridor lay a chamber dominated by a pedestal, carved from the same black stone as the ruins outside. Resting atop it was a fragment of crystal, smaller than she expected, but radiating an intense energy that made her skin prickle. This was it, the artifact everyone was after. Reaching out hesitantly, she brushed her fingers against its surface. Instantly, visions flooded her mind, towering. Cities bathed in golden light, beings with elongated limbs and luminous eyes, machinery humming with unimaginable power. Then came destruction, fire raining from the skies, oceans boiling away, entire civilizations reduced to ash. Gasping, she stumbled backward, clutching her head as the images faded. Whatever this thing was, it held memories or warnings from a time long past, memories of a race that had risen to greatness only to fall catastrophically. And now, millennia later, it had resurfaced, calling to her like a beacon. As dawn broke over the Death Sands, painting the horizon in fiery oranges and purples, Lira emerged from the ruins with the artifact secured in a protective case. Her resolve hardened. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever truths awaited discovery, she would face them head-on. Because if humanity truly intended to carve out a future among the stars, it needed leaders willing to confront the unknown, not cowards content to hide behind corporate lies. With renewed determination, she climbed back onto the hovercraft and set a course deeper into the sands. Behind her, the ruins crumbled further, swallowed by the shifting dunes, as though erasing evidence of her passage. But ahead, the journey promised only greater mysteries and greater dangers. The hovercraft cut through the sands like a blade, slicing water, its engines humming steadily as Lira pushed further into the heart of the Death Sands. The artifact sat securely in its case beside her, radiating an almost imperceptible warmth that seemed to pulse in sync with her heartbeat. She couldn't shake the visions it had shown her, images of a civilization consumed by its own hubris. It wasn't just a relic, it was a warning. And yet she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. Something about it called to her, not with words, but with a pull deeper than instinct. Whatever secrets it held, they were worth uncovering. Even if it killed her, the landscape shifted again, growing more treacherous with each passing kilometer. Towering dunes gave way to vast plains of glass-like sand, smooth and reflective under the alien sun. Shadows danced across the surface, distorted reflections of clouds that didn't exist. Occasionally, the ground would ripple unnaturally, as though the planet itself were alive and restless beneath her feet. Static electricity crackled in the air, making her hair stand on end despite the dampening field generated by her suit. Every breath felt heavier, charged with anticipation or dread. She couldn't tell which. It started with a low rumble, barely audible over the roar of the hovercraft's engines. At first, she thought it was another storm brewing, a common enough occurrence in this forsaken place. But then, the vibrations intensified, shaking the craft violently. Alarms blared as the sensors detected massive movement below the surface. Before she could react, the sands erupted in front of her, sending up a geyser of golden particles that glittered ominously in the sunlight. Out of the chaos emerged a creature unlike anything she'd ever seen. Its body was segmented, sleek and serpentine, covered in iridescent scales that shimmered like oil slicks. Multiple sets of eyes glowed faintly along its length, unblinking and predatory. Rows of razor-sharp teeth lined its gaping maw, wide enough to swallow her entire vehicle whole. This wasn't one of the smaller sand serpents she'd avoided earlier. It was something far larger, far deadlier. A king among predators. Lira reacted instantly, jerking the controls hard to the left as the beast lunged forward. The hovercraft skidded sideways, narrowly avoiding being crushed beneath its bulk. Sand sprayed everywhere, obscuring her vision momentarily as she fought to regain control. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system as survival instincts took over. The plasma cannon mounted atop the craft swiveled automatically, locking onto the target. Without hesitation, she fired. The bolt of superheated energy struck true, searing through the creature's armored hide and eliciting a deafening shriek that echoed across the sands. For a moment, she thought she'd won. Then the serpent thrashed, wildly, its tail whipping around with enough force to send shockwaves rippling through the ground. One of them hit the hovercraft, knocking it off balance and sending it tumbling end over end. Lira screamed as the world spun chaotically around, her metal groaning under the strain. When the craft finally came to rest, upside down and partially buried in the sand, her ears rang painfully, and her vision blurred. She lay there for a moment, dazed, but alive. Pain shot through her ribs where the safety harness had dug enduring the crash, but she forced herself to move. Crawling out from beneath the wreckage, she grabbed the artifact case and slung it over her shoulder before scrambling to her feet. The serpent loomed nearby, wounded but still very much alive. Its glowing eyes locked onto her, tracking her every movement with terrifying precision. There was no time to think, only act. Her hand went to the sidearm, holstered at her hip, drawing the weapon smoothly as she backed away slowly. The pistol was small compared to the plasma cannon, but it packed enough punch to finish what she'd started, if she could get close enough. Taking aim, she squeezed the trigger repeatedly, unleashing bursts of concentrated energy that struck the creature's exposed flesh. Each hit elicited another ear-splitting scream, driving it back temporarily. But it kept coming, relentless and enraged. Just when she thought she wouldn't make it, salvation arrived in the form of an electrical storm. Lightning arced across the sky, striking the sands with explosive force. The sudden surge of energy disrupted the serpent's senses, causing it to recoil in confusion. Seizing the opportunity, Lira sprinted toward a cluster of rocky outcroppings. Nearby, using them as cover while the storm raged overhead. By the time the dust settled, the creature had retreated into the depths, leaving behind only scorch marks and clawed gouges in the sand. Breathing heavily, she leaned against one of the rocks, clutching the artifact tightly. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what she'd just endured. That thing hadn't been natural. No predator evolved to hunt like that, to withstand weapons designed to vaporize tanks. Someone, or something, had engineered it, and if there was one, there were bound to be others. As she caught her breath, a new sound reached her ears. Voices, Human voices, faint at first, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. Cursing under her breath, she peered cautiously around the edge of the rock formation. In the distance, silhouetted against the horizon, she spotted figures moving purposefully through the sands. They wore sleek combat suits marked with the insignia of the Interstellar Trade Consortium, a stylized star encircled by gears. Soldiers, armed and organized. Commander Soren led the group, his imposing frame easily recognizable even from afar. He moved with calculated efficiency, scanning the area methodically as his subordinates fanned out around him. His presence here confirmed her worst fears. The ITC wasn't content to issue warnings or sit idly by while someone else claimed the artifact. They'd come prepared to take it by force and eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Lira ducked back behind the rocks, her mind racing. She couldn't fight them head-on, not alone and injured as she was. But neither could she let them have the artifact. Not after what she'd seen. If they got their hands on it, they'd exploit its power without regard for the consequences. Entire planets could burn because of their greed. No, she had to find another way. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft cough behind her. Whirling. Around, she raised her weapon instinctively, only to lower it when she saw who it was. A man crouched there, gaunt and disheveled, his clothes torn and stained with dirt. His face bore the signs of prolonged exposure to harsh conditions, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He held up his hands placatingly, showing he meant no harm. "You're not going to shoot me," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "Not unless you want to attract attention." "Who are you?" she demanded, keeping the pistol trained on him nonetheless. "Dr. Cale Arden," he replied, rising slowly to his feet. "Xenobiologist, exiled by the ITC for asking too many questions." He gestured toward the soldiers in the distance. "And those are the same bastards who stranded me here weeks ago. Thought I'd die in the sands like everyone else." Despite her suspicions, Lira lowered the weapon slightly. Something about him rang true, though whether it was desperation or genuine sincerity, she couldn't say. Either way, he might prove useful. "What do you know about this place?" she asked, nodding toward the ruins visible in the distance. Kyle hesitated, glancing nervously at the artifact case slung over her shoulder. "More than I should," he admitted finally. "Enough to know that whatever you've got there, it's dangerous. Dangerous enough to destroy entire civilizations." His words sent a chill down her spine. She'd already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed aloud made it all the more real. Still, she needed answers. "Tell me everything," she said firmly, "starting with why the ITC wants it so badly." He nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "The Zorathians, they weren't just advanced. They tapped into forces we can barely comprehend, energy sources tied directly to the fabric of reality itself. If harnessed correctly, it could revolutionize interstellar travel, terraforming, even weaponry. But if misused..." He trailed off, letting the implications hang in the air. "They destroyed themselves," Lira finished for him, recalling the visions she'd experienced. "And now, the ITC thinks they can do better." "Exactly," Cale agreed, grimly. "But they don't understand the risks, or worse, they don't care." Before either of them could say more, the sound of approaching footsteps reached their ears. Ducking back into cover, they watched as two ITC soldiers rounded the rocks, weapons drawn. They hadn't spotted them yet, but it was only a matter of time. Lira exchanged a glance with Cale, silently communicating a plan. Together, they sprang into action. Using the terrain to their advantage, they ambushed the soldiers quickly and quietly, disabling them before they could raise the alarm. Stripping them of their gear, Lyra and Cale disguised themselves in their uniforms, blending seamlessly into the ranks of the search party. It was risky, but it bought them precious time to gather intelligence and formulate a strategy. As they rejoined the main group, Commander Soren eyed them suspiciously, but said nothing. His focus remained fixed on the horizon where the ruins loomed ever closer. Whatever his plans were, they involved reaching the artifact first and eliminating any obstacles in his path. For now, Lira played along, biding her time. But deep down, she knew the real battle was only beginning. The sands whispered secrets, the ruins hid dangers untold, and the artifact pulsed with a power that defied comprehension. Humanity's ingenuity had brought her this far, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when betrayal lurked around every corner. And so, with the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, she pressed onward, determined to see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. The ruins loomed ahead, like the skeletal remains of a long-dead god, their jagged spires clawing at the alien sky. The closer they drew to them, the heavier the air became, thick with static electricity and an oppressive sense of foreboding. Each step felt deliberate, as though the sands themselves resisted their intrusion. Lira adjusted her stolen uniform, trying to blend seamlessly into the ranks of the ITC soldiers marching toward the ancient structures. Beside her, Kyle walked stiffly, his posture rigid, but his eyes darting nervously between the artifact case slung over her shoulder and the towering silhouette of Commander Soren. Soren was a man who radiated authority, not through charisma or charm, but through sheer force of will. His presence commanded obedience, his sharp features etched with years of ruthless decision-making. He led the group without hesitation, every movement calculated, every order precise. Yet beneath his composed exterior lay something darker, a cold pragmatism that saw life as expendable and morality as negotiable. To him, the Death Sands were not a mystery to be unraveled, but a resource to be conquered. And the artifact? A tool to cement humanity's dominance over the stars. As they approached the ruins, the ground trembled faintly, sending ripples through the sands. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something else entirely. The vibrations carried a rhythm, almost melodic in nature, resonating deep within Lyra's chest. She glanced at Kyle, whose face had gone pale. "They're waking up," he muttered under his breath, barely audible even to her. "Whatever's buried here, it knows we're coming." Lira didn't respond, but her grip tightened on the artifact case. If the ruins truly held remnants of Zorathian technology, or worse, some form of consciousness, then they weren't just trespassing. They were provoking forces far beyond human understanding. And yet turning back wasn't an option. Not with Soren so close, his ambitions driving him forward like a machine incapable of stopping. Inside the ruins, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, glowing with intricate patterns that shifted and rearranged themselves as though alive. Glyphs similar to those on the artifact shimmered across the surfaces, casting an otherworldly light that made shadows dance unnaturally. The air hummed with energy, vibrating against their skin like a low frequency. Every instinct screamed at Lira to leave, to run as far away from this place as possible, but curiosity rooted her feet firmly in place. Kyle moved cautiously beside her, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. "This is incredible," he whispered, awe evident in his voice. "These glyphs, they're not just symbols, they're equations, instructions for manipulating energy fields at a quantum level." He reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers against one of the glowing patterns. Instantly, the glyph flared brighter, releasing a burst of light that illuminated the entire chamber. "What did you do?" Lira hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. I don't know," Kyle stammered, wide-eyed. "But I think I activated something." Before either of them could react further, the floor beneath their feet began to shift. Panels slid open, revealing hidden mechanisms that whirred to life with mechanical precision. From the depths emerged constructs, unlike anything they'd ever seen, humanoid, figures forged from polished metal, their limbs jointed in ways that defied conventional engineering. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie blue light as the glyphs, and their movements were eerily fluid despite their metallic composition. Automatons, Kyle breathed, recognizing the design instantly. Guardians programmed to protect whatever lies within. Commander Soren barked orders, his soldiers raising their weapons and firing indiscriminately at the advancing machines. Plasma bolts struck true, tearing through the construct's armor and leaving scorch marks on their frames. But instead of falling, the automatons adapted. Damaged sections resealed themselves almost instantly, repairs happening before their very eyes. Worse still, they retaliated with devastating efficiency, unleashing bursts of energy that sent soldiers flying backward. Their suits ruptured and bodies broken. Chaos erupted as the group scattered, seeking cover behind crumbling pillars. And fallen debris, Lira dragged Kael into a narrow alcove, shielding them both from the crossfire. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. These things weren't just machines. They were extensions of the Zorathian legacy, imbued with intelligence far surpassing anything humanity had created. Fighting them head-on was suicide. "We need to shut them down," she said urgently, scanning the room for any sign of control panels or weak points. "There has to be a way to disable them." Kyle nodded grimly. "If these are Guardians, then their programming must be tied to the artifact. Maybe if we can reach it—" He cut himself off as one of the automatons turned its glowing gaze directly toward them. With alarming speed, it lunged forward, its claws extended like blades. Lira reacted instinctively, shoving Kyle aside as she rolled out of the way. The automaton's strike missed her by inches, gouging a deep trench into the stone where she'd been standing moments earlier. She scrambled to her feet, drawing her sidearm and firing repeatedly at its exposed joints. Sparks flew, but the construct kept coming, relentless and unyielding. Desperation fueled her next move, grabbing the artifact. "Case!" She hurled it at the automaton's torso, hoping the impact would disorient it long enough for her to escape. Instead, the case shattered upon contact, releasing a surge of energy that engulfed the machine in a blinding flash of light. For a moment, everything froze. The constructs paused mid-motion, their glowing eyes dimming slightly as though confused. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the effect faded, and the automatons resumed their assault. But something had changed. Their focus shifted, no longer targeting the soldiers indiscriminately. Now, they zeroed in on Lira and Kael, ignoring everyone else. Whatever connection existed between the artifact and the Guardians, it had marked them as the primary threat. "This isn't working," Kyle shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't fight them." "Then we don't fight them," Lira snapped back, her mind racing. "We outsmart them." She spotted a narrow staircase spiraling upward along the wall, leading to a higher platform overlooking the chamber. Motioning for Kael to follow, she sprinted toward it, weaving through the chaos as plasma bolts and energy beams crisscrossed. Around them, behind them, the automatons pursued relentlessly, their metallic footsteps echoing ominously in the confined space. Reaching the top, Lira found herself in a smaller chamber, dominated by a massive console covered in more of the glowing glyphs. In the center of the console rested another fragment of the artifact, identical to the one she'd retrieved earlier. This was the source, the heart of the ruin's power. Without hesitation, she approached it, placing her hands on the console and closing her eyes. The visions returned instantly, flooding her mind with images of Zorathian cities, collapsing under waves of destruction, their creators consumed by their own creations. "No!" she murmured, shaking her head violently. "Not again!" Kyle joined her, studying the console with frantic urgency. "It's a fail-safe," he realized aloud, "a self-destruct mechanism. If we activate it, we can destroy the core and everything connected to it." And us along with it, Lira countered sharply. Activating the failsafe would mean sacrificing not only the artifact, but also anyone trapped inside the ruins when it detonated, including themselves. It's the only way, Kyle insisted, his voice trembling but resolute. If we don't stop this now, Soren will use the artifact to enslave entire worlds. You've seen what happens when that kind of power falls into the wrong hands. Lira hesitated, torn between duty and survival, the weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than ever before. She thought of her family, lost to corporate greed, of the countless lives that would suffer if the ITC succeeded, of the civilizations destroyed because they couldn't resist the allure of forbidden knowledge. Could she make the same mistake? Before she could decide, the sound of boots on metal announced Soren's arrival. He strode into the chamber, his weapon trained on them, his expression unreadable. "Step away from the console," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "You've caused enough trouble. You don't understand what you're dealing with." Lira shot back, stepping protectively in front of Kael. "This isn't about power or conquest. It's about survival, for all of us." Soren sneered, unmoved by her plea. "Survival belongs to the strong. The rest are just collateral damage." In that moment, clarity struck Lira like a lightning bolt. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't its ability to dominate or exploit. It was its capacity for sacrifice, for choosing the greater good over personal gain, for standing firm in the face of impossible odds. And if she wanted to honor that legacy, she had to act. With a final glance at Kael, she slammed her palm onto the console, triggering the failsafe sequence. Alarms blared throughout the ruins, red lights flashing as the chamber began to shake violently. Soren roared in fury, raising his weapon, but it was too late. The automatons converged on him and his remaining soldiers, cutting off their escape. "Go!" Lira shouted, pushing Kyle toward the staircase. "Get out of here!" "What about you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'll hold them off," she replied, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "Just promise me you'll tell the galaxy what happened here. That humanity doesn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past." Tears welled in Kyle's eyes, but he nodded, turning and sprinting down the stairs as fast as his legs could carry him. Alone now, Lira faced the approaching automatons, her weapon raised defiantly. She wouldn't go down without a fight. Outside, Kyle emerged into the open sands just as the ruins began to collapse inward, swallowed by the earth itself. A shock wave rippled outward, knocking him off his feet and sending plumes of sand billowing into the air. When he looked back, there was nothing left, only a gaping chasm where the ruins had once stood. For a long moment he sat there, staring at the devastation, grief and guilt warring within him. Lira had given everything to ensure the artifact wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, to protect the future from repeating the tragedies of the past, and now it was up to him to honor her sacrifice. As the dust settled, a faint glow caught his eye, a shard of crystal half buried in the sand. Nearby, it pulsed softly as though calling to him. Hesitant but unable to resist, he picked it up, feeling its warmth seep into his palm. Visions flickered briefly in his mind, images of hope amidst ruin, of new beginnings rising from ashes. The sands whispered again, their voices softer now, almost comforting. They carried a message, clear and undeniable. The sands were only the beginning. The chasm yawned open like the maw of some ancient beast, swallowing the ruins whole as the failsafe sequence reached its crescendo. The ground trembled violently beneath Kael's feet, forcing him to stumble backward, clutching the shard tightly in his hand. Its faint glow pulsed rhythmically, almost as if it were alive, responding to the cataclysm unfolding around him. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the destruction, the culmination of Lira's sacrifice. She had stayed behind to ensure the artifact wouldn't fall into Soren's hands, and now the ruins were collapsing into oblivion, taking with them any trace of the Zorathian legacy. But something wasn't right. Deep within the chasm, a low hum began to rise, growing louder and more resonant with each passing second. It wasn't the sound of collapse, it was something else entirely, a vibration that seemed to emanate not just from the earth, but from the very fabric of reality itself. The air shimmered unnaturally, distorting the horizon as though the laws of physics were unraveling at the seams. Sand particles levitated, briefly before being sucked downward, spiraling into the abyss like moths drawn to a flame. Kael's instinct screamed at him to run, but he froze, transfixed by the sight. From the depths of the chasm emerged a column of light, pure, blinding, and impossibly bright. It stretched upward into the alien sky, piercing through the clouds and illuminating the Death Sands in an ethereal glow. Within the light, shapes began to form, geometric patterns shifting and rearranging themselves, pulsing with energy that made his skin prickle. These weren't random designs, they were symbols, glyphs identical to those etched into the ruins and the artifact shards. They spoke directly to his mind, bypassing language and logic, conveying emotions and concepts too vast for human comprehension. And then came the voice. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense, not a sound carried by airwaves, but rather a presence that filled his consciousness, overwhelming yet strangely comforting. It spoke without words, communicating through feelings and images. Visions flooded his mind, civilizations rising and falling, stars birthing new worlds, galaxies colliding and merging. He saw humanity among them, a young species, fragile and flawed, yet brimming with potential. The voice didn't judge or condemn. Instead, it offered understanding, an invitation. You seek knowledge, it said, or perhaps thought, projecting the idea directly into his mind. But knowledge carries responsibility. Will you accept this burden? Before Kael could respond, the vision shifted. He saw himself standing on a barren planet, surrounded by ruins far grander than those buried in the sands. In his hands, he held not one shard, but many, their combined glow casting light across the desolation. Around him others gathered, humans, aliens, machines, all united by a shared purpose. They worked together, rebuilding what had been lost, forging connections where none had existed before. Hope radiated from the scene, tempered by the weight of hard-won wisdom. Then the vision darkened. The same planet lay in ruins once more, scorched and lifeless. This time Kael stood alone amidst the devastation, holding a single shard that pulsed erratically, its light flickering like a dying star. Despair washed over him, crushing in its intensity. He understood now. The choice wasn't merely about preserving knowledge, it was about how that knowledge would be used. Humanity's ingenuity could create wonders or unleash horrors. The line between salvation and destruction was razor-thin. The voice returned, softer this time. Choose wisely. With a jolt, Kael snapped back to reality, gasping for breath as though surfacing from deep water. The light still shone brightly, but its intensity had dimmed slightly, as if waiting for his decision. Behind him, the sands churned restlessly, as though the planet itself were holding its breath. He glanced down at the shard in his hand, its glow steady and unwavering. Whatever power it contained, it was incomplete, a fragment of something far greater. Yet even this small piece carried enough potential to alter the course of history. His thoughts turned to Lira. She had sacrificed everything to prevent the artifact from falling into the wrong hands, trusting that someone, anyone, would carry the torch she had lit. Her actions hadn't been driven by fear or despair, but by hope. Hope that humanity could rise above its flaws, that it could learn from the mistakes of those who came before. And now the responsibility rested squarely on his shoulders. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roaring winds. "I'll make sure we use this wisely." The light flared briefly in response, then began to recede, retreating back into the chasm until only a faint glow remained. As suddenly as it had appeared, the phenomenon vanished, leaving the Death Sands eerily silent. The storm clouds dissipated, revealing a sky painted in hues of gold and crimson. For the first time since entering this forsaken place, Kyle felt a sense of calm settle over him. Whatever force had spoken to him, it had accepted his answer, for now. Meanwhile, deep within the collapsing ruins, Lira fought desperately against impossible odds. The automatons swarmed her, their glowing eyes locked onto her every movement. Plasma bolts ricocheted off the walls, carving jagged scars into the ancient stone. Her weapon was nearly depleted, its charge flickering dangerously low. Still, she refused to give up. Every step she took bought precious seconds for Kyle to escape, and every shot she fired brought her closer to ensuring the artifact wouldn't fall into Soren's grasp. She ducked behind a crumbling pillar, reloading, her pistol with trembling hands. Blood trickled down her temple from a gash caused by flying debris, but she ignored the pain, focusing solely on survival. One automaton lunged at her, its claws slicing through the air mere inches from her face. She rolled sideways, firing blindly as she scrambled to her feet. The bolt struck true, tearing through its torso and sending it crashing to the ground. But another took its place instantly, relentless and unyielding. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. The chamber was collapsing around her, chunks of rock raining down from the ceiling as the fail-safe sequence reached its final stages. Dust filled the air, choking her lungs and obscuring her vision. Through the haze, she spotted Commander Soren nearby, pinned beneath a fallen beam, his expression twisted in rage and desperation. "You've doomed us all," he snarled, struggling futilely against the weight pressing down on him. "Do you think destroying this place will stop progress? Humanity will find another way." Lira met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with defiance. "Progress isn't worth anything if it costs our soul," she spat back. "Maybe losing this will teach us to value what really matters." Soren opened his mouth to retort, but the ground shook violently, cutting him off. A massive fissure split the floor, widening rapidly as the ruins continued to crumble. With a final roar of fury, Soren disappeared into the abyss, swallowed whole by the collapsing structure. Lira turned away, unwilling to watch as the man who embodied humanity's greed met his end. As the chamber collapsed further, she spotted a narrow tunnel leading upward, partially obscured by falling debris. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she sprinted toward it, dodging falling rocks and leaping over gaps in the floor. The automatons pursued her relentlessly, their metallic forms gleaming dully in the fading light. Just as she reached the tunnel entrance, one of them tackled her from behind, pinning her to the ground. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to stay calm. Reaching into her belt, she pulled out a small, explosive charge, one of the few tools she'd salvaged from her hovercraft. With a savage cry, she jammed it into the automaton's chest cavity and activated the timer. The machine froze momentarily, its systems processing the threat before attempting to dislodge the device. Too late. The charge detonated, engulfing both the automaton and several others in a fiery explosion that sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber. Seizing the opportunity, Lira scrambled to her feet and dove into the tunnel, crawling frantically as the ruins collapsed behind her. Rocks tumbled down around her, narrowly missing her head as she clawed her way forward. Her muscles burned with exertion and her lungs screamed for air, but she refused to stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she burst free from the tunnel, tumbling onto the sands outside. The sunlight hit her like a physical force, blinding after the darkness of the ruins. She lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, her body battered and bruised, but miraculously intact. Above her, the alien sky stretched endlessly, its colors vibrant and alive. Somewhere in the distance, she spotted Kael standing near the edge of the chasm, staring at something in his hand. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by guilt. She had survived when so many others hadn't, including Soren and countless soldiers caught in the crossfire. Pushing herself upright, she staggered toward him, her legs shaking with every step. When she finally reached him, she collapsed too, her knees clutching the sand for support. Kael turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You're alive," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Barely," she replied, managing a weak smile despite the pain coursing through her body. "What happened here?" He held up the shard, its glow steady and reassuring. "It spoke to me," he explained haltingly, "showed me possibilities, choices. I think it wanted me to understand what's at stake." Lira nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the chasm. "Good, because whatever happens next, we can't let anyone repeat the Zorathians' mistakes. We have to do better." For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching as the sand settled and the wind carried away the last traces of destruction. The Death Sands had claimed its toll, but it had also revealed something far greater, the resilience of humanity, capable of enduring even the harshest trials. And though the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, they faced it together, armed with knowledge and determination. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest whisper echoed across the sands, carried by the wind. The sands were only the beginning. The hovercraft hummed steadily as it carved through the endless expanse of the Death Sands, its engines straining against the shifting terrain. Lira sat at the controls, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the alien sky blushed faintly with the first light of dawn. Beside her, Kael leaned forward, poring over a datapad filled with fragmented coordinates and cryptic glyphs retrieved from the ruins. The shard rested securely in its case between them, its glow pulsing softly, as if keeping time with their thoughts. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary now, their shared understanding forged in the crucible of survival and sacrifice. Yet beneath the silence lay an unspoken question, one that lingered like a shadow over everything they had accomplished. What came next? They had destroyed the artifact's core, thwarted Soren's ambitions, and glimpsed the vast potential and peril of Zorathian technology. But the galaxy was vast, and the forces arrayed against them were relentless. This victory, hard won as it was only a single battle in a much larger war. Kael broke the quiet first, his voice hesitant but tinged with cautious optimism. "These coordinates, they're incomplete, but they point to other sites, places where more artifacts might be hidden." Lira nodded without looking at him, her jaw tightening slightly. "You think we should go after them?" "I think we don't have a choice," he replied, his tone firm despite the uncertainty etched into his features. "If even one of those sites falls into the wrong hands, everything we've done here will be for nothing." She didn't argue. Deep down, she knew he was right. Destroying the core hadn't erased the danger. It had merely delayed it. The Zorathians' legacy was scattered across the stars, buried in forgotten worlds and ancient ruins. Each fragment carried the same promise and peril as the one they now guarded. To leave them untouched would be irresponsible. To destroy them outright might erase knowledge humanity desperately needed. There was no easy answer, only difficult choices. As the hovercraft crested a dune, the landscape shifted subtly. Ahead, the sands gave way to a jagged ridge of black rock, its surface pockmarked with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. It wasn't part of their planned route, but something about it drew their attention. A pull deeper than curiosity. Lira slowed the craft, bringing it to a stop near the base of the ridge. "What is this place?" she murmured, stepping out onto the sand. Her boots crunched softly against the grains, which shimmered unnaturally under the rising sun. Kael joined her, his eyes scanning the ridge with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "I don't know, but those markings, they're similar to the ones in the ruins." Before either of them could investigate further, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't the static charge of the Death Sands or the mechanical whir of automatons. It was something else entirely, something alive. The ridge began to shift, its rocky surface splitting open to reveal a hidden chamber within. From the darkness emerged a faint blue light, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Lira instinctively reached for her sidearm, her muscles tensing as adrenaline coursed through her veins. But Kael placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the unease in his eyes. "We need to see what's inside." Reluctantly, she lowered her weapon, though her grip remained tight. Together, they approached the entrance, their footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The chamber beyond was small but intricate, its walls covered in glowing glyphs that seemed to rearrange themselves as they moved closer. At its center stood a pedestal identical to the one in the ruins, except this time it held not a single shard, but an entire crystalline structure, a lattice of interlocking fragments that radiated energy so intense it made the air shimmer. Kael stepped forward hesitantly, his breath catching in his throat. This isn't just another artifact, it's a key, a map." "To what?" Lira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, but whatever it leads to, it's bigger than anything we've faced so far." For a long moment they stood there, staring at the crystalline structure in stunned silence. Its glow pulsed brighter, casting their shadows long across the chamber floor. Then, without warning, it emitted a soft chime, a sound that resonated deep within their chests, as though awakening something dormant. And then came the message, not spoken aloud, but projected directly into their minds. A series of images flashed before them, distant planets, alien civilizations, cosmic phenomena unlike anything they'd ever seen. And woven throughout these visions was a single phrase, repeated over and over. The sands were only the beginning. When the vision faded, Lira turned to Kael, her expression grim but resolute. "Looks like we're not done yet." He met her gaze, nodding slowly. "No, we're not." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices. Voices that sounded almost human. As they climbed back into the hovercraft and set a course for the unknown, the sands stretched endlessly before them, shimmering like liquid gold under the alien sun. Somewhere out there, new challenges awaited, new allies, new enemies, and perhaps new hope. But one thing was certain, the journey was far from over.